is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Boko Haram has killed, kidnapped, and terrorized Nigerians and the country's neighbors for a decade now. The group, founded by Mohammed Yusuf in 2002, was initially non-violent. But in 2009, it began its campaign of terror. In 10 years, it has murdered over 30,000 people. So how has Boko Haram been able to continue its reign of terror for a decade unchecked? And why has it taken so long to defeat? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa.
Over the last decade, Boko Haram has been active mainly in the northeastern states of Nigeria. Let's take a look at some of Boko Haram's deadliest attacks. The uprising began in Kano in July 2009, when bombings and shootings left more than 200 people dead in Kano city. A Nigerian military task force responded, leaving more than 700 Boko Haram members dead and its operational mosque in Maiduguri destroyed. 2011 saw several deadly attacks across the country. During the inauguration of Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan in May, Boko Haram detonated 3 IEDs near a military barracks in the city of Bauchi. In August, they attacked the United Nations compound in Abuja using a car bomb which killed 23 people and injured more than 75 others. On November 4th, more than 100 people died in multiple attacks in Yobe and Borno states. One of their largest attacks came on January 20, 2012. More than 200 people were killed when Boko Haram launched coordinated attacks targeting police, military, a prison and other targets in the city of Kano. On April 19, 2013, battles between Boko Haram and multinational security forces from Niger, Nigeria and Chad in the city of Baga left nearly 200 people dead, including many civilians. The terror group gained major international attention on April 14, 2014, when they abducted 276 schoolgirls from the town of Chibok in Borno State. In June, 3 major attacks took place, which killed an estimated 400 to 500 people in the state of Borno, and around 100 women were also kidnapped. In January 2015, Boko Haram conducted their deadliest attack, a multi-day raid in Baga, where they massacred 2,000 people. 31 attacks were also recorded in the first few months of 2015 in Cameroon, Chad and Niger. In February 2016, militants from Boko Haram attacked 2 villages in northeast Nigeria, killing over 80 people. In another attack, 2 female suicide bombers killed 58 people at a Nigerian refugee camp for villagers fleeing terrorism. A suspected attack by Boko Haram on a funeral gathering in July 2019 in Borno left at least 65 people dead.
Now, in addition to the deaths caused by Boko Haram attacks, over 2 million Nigerians have also been displaced. Many have been forced to live in refugee camps and now struggle to survive. Our correspondent Daniel Arap Moy brings us more on the devastating impact the last 10 years of Boko Haram has had on ordinary Nigerians.
Since the start of the year, more than 100,000 people have been fleeing the long Boko Haram insurgency. Majority of them fear returning to their homes.
Now I'm in God's hands. If peace is restored one day and I'm told that I can go back home, I'll go back to my village immediately. But as time goes by, the situation isn't changing, so there's no way I can go home.
For over a decade, attacks by Boko Haram have killed 27,000 people. Nearly 2 million others have been displaced. Mass kidnappings have also been a common occurrence. In 2014, the militants seized the world's kidnapped nearly 300 schoolgirls from Chibok. Some have since been released, others remain in captivity. At the displacement camps, international aid agencies struggle to cater basic needs.
Hunger is the biggest problem. We're starving. We just need people to give us something to eat. I work so that I can eat, but I'm still hungry.
The government is using people to return home as soon as the situation becomes better. Some of the IDPs have tried returning to their homes but have been forced to go back to Maiduguri due to the constant attacks by the Islamist group.
I just thought that my life is in risk and my children, because no quality education, no health services, no, it's too much. So I have to come back. I'm just like I'm living in a cage. Yeah, because you are sharing a room with a family of 6. It's not easy.
10 years on, the violence by Boko Haram still continue. Thousands are still fleeing their homes. The Nigerian government, however, insists that they have managed to defeat the sect. Daniel Arap Moy, CGTN.
Well, the Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria has been ongoing for 10 years now. And joining me to further discuss the Boko Haram terrorist group, from Lagos, Colonel Hassan Stanlabo, a security consultant and retired Nigerian army officer. From Abuja, Al-Qasim Abdul Kadir, head of the Media and Communications Presidential Committee on the Northeast Initiative. And with me here in Nairobi, Dr. Hassan Kanenje, the director of the Horn Institute here in Kenya. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Colonel Stanlabo, let me start off with you because you have been in the Nigerian military and have first-hand knowledge of the Boko Haram insurgency. It's been a decade now of a Boko Haram insurgency, and according to the Council on Foreign Relations, over 30,000 people have been killed and more than 2 million have been displaced. It looks like instead of being degraded and eliminated, Boko Haram seems to have flourished in Nigeria. Why is that?
I would say they are receiving quite a huge, massive external support, all right, from both ISWA and all the rest, other criminal elements outside the operational space. And this massive support has actually been able to enable them garner enough resilience to be able to sustain themselves as far as this battle is concerned.
So let me come back to you though, Colonel Stanlabo, because you're talking about them receiving external support. Do we know exactly the specifics of where this support is coming from and how much exactly is that support that Boko Haram is receiving?
You must understand these are terrorist groups. And if you understand the way terrorist groups operate, in most cases, the support they receive may not be even in cash, it could be in kind. For instance, we are very much aware that a few months back, way back last year, there was this long queue of about 40 jeeps, you know, that drove all the way from the Maghreb, brand new jeeps. And these vehicles were, of course, delivered to Boko Haram, coming out from several other terrorist groups that are contributing their own quota by way of assistance. Terrorist groups generally, globally, assist themselves in one way or the other, so that when it gets to my turn, I look up to you for assistance. It could be in terms of manpower, it could be in terms of material, whatever. And in some cases where cash is required, such cash also comes in from wealthy individuals scattered all over the globe that want to support their cause.
Al-Qasim, let me get your thoughts on this, though. Is it also your understanding that Boko Haram has flourished, growing in size and territorially, and basically the region in West Africa is now unable to control Boko Haram?
One of the reasons why the Boko Haram has continued to flourish in Nigeria and the West African sub-region is because one of the reasons is because of Nigeria's porous borders. 5 years ago, we discovered that Nigeria has more than 1,000 entry points which are not manned by the customs and also the immigration. So the high rate of poverty, the increasing accessibility to terrorists from other countries like Chad, Niger is also a factor that contributes to their flourishing factor. However, we have also discovered that in the last 10 years that the Boko Haram insurgents have used a system of asymmetric warfare to continue to wage war against the Nigerian state. This is not a conventional warfare. In terms of a conventional warfare, it is easy for the army to actually fight them. Finally, the northeastern corner of Nigeria also has a lot of ungoverned spaces. You see large swaths of land without any form of civil authority, either the police or local government authorities and all that. And they find these places as a safe haven to be able to set up and attack innocent civilians and also soldiers who operate in those general areas.
Dr. Haneja, you've heard the sentiments from in Nigeria there, but it does seem that Boko Haram, despite the fact that there has been a crackdown for the last 10 years, seems to be continuing to recruit into its masses. So who exactly are they targeting in terms of recruitment? And why does the government seem unable, according to the, to the sentiment from Nigeria, why does the government seem unable to deal with this situation?
I think the resilience of Boko Haram can be attributed to two things. Number one, I think from the beginning, from the outset, there was a gross underestimation of the capacity and the influence that Boko Haram actually has in conducting warfare against the state. Number two, can be attributed to the fact that the collapse of Libya, for instance, and other states in North and West Africa led to proliferation of arms, and therefore this group was able to equip itself, to arm itself, and to spread. And thirdly, I think there's been an over-reliance on hard power instead of soft power. I think to be successful in dealing with a terrorist group in any given country, it's important that you combine both the soft and hard approaches, but over-reliance on hard approaches alone is not sufficient, because while you may be able to defeat them militarily, in certain cases, you cannot defeat them ideologically, in part because there is a large pool of disenfranchised young people and population they can actually recruit from.
Colonel Stan Labo, there is an over-reliance on a military approach instead of looking at the root causes of Boko Haram. Your thoughts?
Well, I think to a greater extent, the Nigerian government or the armed forces on ground had little alternative than applying the hard approach. If you've been on ground here in Nigeria, especially in the northeast, you would understand what I'm saying. We can only begin to talk about the soft approach when you have been able to allow some sanity to prevail within the general area. And in the course of trying to bring about this sanity, it is the hard approach that comes in, okay? To a greater extent, we are beginning to have what I will call some respite. And in certain areas, especially in the rare area that have already been cleared by the military, the soft approach Doc is talking about begins to come in. We now have some level of civil presence. Populations are beginning to come back in some of these areas, though very minimal. And of course, every attempt is being put in place to see to what extent, whatever the deficits that existed initially that led to all this, to a greater extent, such gaps are beginning to be filled. And what do I mean by this? Education has been neglected up north for too long by serial governments, not just this, by serial governments. And education has a great deal to do with this.
Al-Qasim, there is an understanding here, though, from Colonel Stan Labo that education or the area of northeastern Nigeria where Boko Haram is rife has largely been neglected, giving rise to an easier entry point for Boko Haram. Do you agree with that assessment?
What has happened is that northeastern Nigeria, especially Borno State, alongside Chad and Niger and also northern Cameroon, parts of sub-Saharan Africa which have some of the worst indices in the world. We're not only talking about education, we're also talking about maternal mortality. We're talking about general health care. We're talking about other indices of poverty and longevity. It is a combination of factors of several years of misgovernance in this particular space that has led us to where we are today. In the last 10 years, these indices have gone from bad to worse because there are children who have not been in school in 10 years. Hospitals have been destroyed. Livelihoods have been destroyed. Farmlands have been destroyed and all that. What we have seen is an economic loss put in the region of around $1.6 billion US. And if we don't have peace, it will be very difficult for the Nigerian government to be able to rebuild this region, this state in particular, especially the states of Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe.
You have mentioned, though, Al-Qasim, that this is coming out of years of misgovernance. Now that the government knows that part of the reason is a misgovernance issue, are there policies that have been put in place over the last 10 years, Al-Qasim, to try and counter that idea of misgovernance or that system of misgovernance?
Yes, absolutely. One of the government has set up a couple of agencies to try and redirect the misfortunes of the Northeast. One of them is the Presidential Committee on the Victim Support Fund, which is a $500 million grant to rebuild the infrastructure of the Northeast. This agency in the last 5 years has been able to rebuild schools, hospitals, police stations, and has generally tried to restore civil authority. The current government of President Muhammadu Buhari has also set up the Northeast Development Commission, NEDC, which is targeted towards bringing back lost livelihoods, which is has committed itself to ensuring that people go back to school.
Right.
One of its mandates is also to ensure that de-radicalization takes place in the entire communities of the Northeast. So because of that, we have the Operation Safe Corridor, which gives insurgents and combatants the opportunity to lay down their arms and go in for training so that they can also be able to have livelihoods after undergoing trainings to say no to the violence that have become part of their lives in the last 10 years. So I think government efforts are ongoing. Government on a daily basis are coming up with both hard and soft strategies in order to ameliorate the sufferings of the people of the Northeast.
Let me get your thoughts, Dr. Kaneje. The soft approach you've heard from what the government in Nigeria is trying to do to eradicate Boko Haram and the military stance. Is that enough to eradicate Boko Haram?
Addressing terrorist insurgency requires or calls for a multisectoral and a multifaceted approach. Now, in recent weeks, I think we have seen that presidential initiative. It has allowed more than 100 Boko Haram to actually come back and just lay down arms. However, it's not sufficient. The current multinational joint task force with troop contributing countries such as Chad, Niger, Cameroon, and Nigeria is trying to do some work. However, it needs a lot of technical, logistical training and support. But at the same time, it has to be combined with other soft approaches such as counter-narratives, counter-messaging. But at the same time, perhaps try to establish action plans for various states to speak to peculiarities and uniqueness of the needs of those states.
All right, gentlemen, we'll leave it there for the moment. Do stay with us on the program. We're going to take a short break now. When we return, we'll look at possible solutions to Boko Haram and other terrorist groups across Africa. Don't go away.
You're watching breaking news on CGTN.
Welcome to the world today on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Now, still with me are Colonel Hassan Stan Labo, Qasim Abdul Kadir, and Dr. Hassan Kanej joining me here in Nairobi. Now, before the break, we looked at some reasons why Boko Haram has been an active terrorist group for the last 10 years. Let's now look more broadly at terrorism across Africa and some possible solutions to that menace. Let me start off with you, Dr. Khaneja, because we've talked about Boko Haram having killed over 30,000 people over the last 10 years. But when you hear about Boko Haram on the international scene, it doesn't seem to have garnered enough international attention. Why is that, though?
I think part of it is just the way the world politics is played. And a lot of times, for instance, problems on the African continent are not highlighted sufficiently unless they have a bearing, especially, to the Western world. Now, Boko Haram, of course, has killed probably more people than most terrorist groups in Europe. They've done that. However, it is normally seen and mainly as a West African problem. Even though, of course, you have increasingly Europe, especially France and the United States in the West, they're actually supporting joint efforts to combat Boko Haram. Now, I think it's going to be dangerous to ignore or to think that Boko Haram is an exclusively West African problem. We know sections of Boko Haram, they've pledged allegiance to actually ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, and they have spread in the entire region, like Chad Basin and stuff like that. And if we do not work jointly together to try and contain it, it's going to spread, because the philosophy that informs Boko Haram is infectious, and the same philosophy that has seen the rise and proliferation of terrorist groups, not just across the continent, but across the Middle East and the rest of the world.
All right. Abdul Qasim, is that a general feeling, though, that the world has largely left the Boko Haram issue to become pretty much a West African situation?
On the contrary, Nigeria has enjoyed global support from its partners. For example, the United States, the United Kingdom, China, and even local neighbors like Cameroon, Chad, and Niger have supported Nigeria, especially with the rallying force of the French government. So, for example, satellite images are shared by these countries with the Nigerian army, and also in terms of intel are shared by the armies of these countries with the Nigerian army. Most importantly, multinational and international organizations from this country have responded to the humanitarian situation in the Northeast. So I say that with all sense of responsibility, that we have enjoyed the contributions of governments from all over the world.
Dr. Khaneja, as a conflict resolution expert, though, we've looked at the various options that Nigeria and the region is using to fight Boko Haram. Would it be a good or a bad idea, though, to invite the insurgents for a talk, for instance, for a roundtable discussion, for instance?
I'm not sure it's a roundtable as such, but I think we always have to be open to negotiating with people we don't agree with, because, as they say, we don't make peace with our friends, we make peace with our enemies. Now, of course, there are elements within Boko Haram that perhaps may be mainstreamed, and we have seen the United States right now is actually negotiating with the Taliban. I'm not suggesting we'll have to have the same approach, but we have to be open. And I think that presidential initiative by President Buhari to engage certain sections of Boko Haram is actually bearing fruit, and that explains why close to 200 in the past few weeks have actually laid down arms and joined the government and the civilian population.
Colonel Hassan, I see you're smiling on this question. Would it be a good idea, though, or a bad idea to have a discussion with the insurgents?
Yeah, it's a good idea to exploit what I want to call the diplomatic option. But like it is, we must look for a very good third party to do this, because like it is presently, I doubt if the belligerents can sit on the same table with us. But I think if we have a reputable third party, like the International Red Cross and so on, or even some of the superpowers, they could do that and, come in between and be able to talk to both sides and bring us to a round table. It is possible.
Al-Qasim, let me get your thoughts on that question.
I think it's very important that we bring this to an end. This has been 10 years of bloodletting. People have died, livelihoods has been lost, and all that. It's time to give peace a chance. I think we should be able to come to a table and down our weapons so that this should become a thing of the past. For example, children have not been in school in some parts for almost 10 years. This is unthinkable. But if there's peace, then people will be able to go to school, and livelihoods will be able to return to normal. So it's important that we're able to have a conversation around peace returning to the region.
Dr. Kaneje, global terrorism is a global phenomenon now. When you look at other groups, though, and how other groups have been dealt with, what has worked in terms of dealing with groups like ISIS, with groups like Al-Shabaab, with groups like Al-Qaeda, that could be used to try and eliminate Boko Haram?
First of all, terrorist groups, militarily, it is important that degraded, because even any negotiation for it to be successful, they must see an interest in talking. But if they think they're winning on the military front, or at least on the battleground, I think they're going to be less willing to talk. However, one thing that has worked, that we know works actually, not just with terrorist groups, but also insurgency groups, which are not exactly terrorist groups, for instance, in civil war cases, is all options have to be on the table. We have to be able to co-opt moderate elements from those who are willing and mainstream them, for instance. And those ones are likely to sideline the other group and impose some heavy penalties, move a process towards employing also soft approaches in which we actually involve the populations, because remember, these groups draw from local populations. They have support from local populations. And right now, one thing that Boko Haram is doing very poorly, for instance, unlike some of the other groups, is they don't provide any services, they just destroy. And so when it comes to counter-messaging and a government adopting a soft approach to bring some development and things such as those ones, I think we're likely going to see a government win a lot more as compared to the group. But as I said, we have to be willing to explore all options, both the peaceful and the military.
Right, as we explore all options. Gentlemen, I want to get your final comment before we wind up. I'll start off with you, Colonel Stan Labo. What do you see as the future of Boko Haram in Nigeria? How do you think, in your view, how can Boko Haram be eliminated?
First of all, we need to understand what their weaknesses are, and we exploit those weaknesses if we have to bring this to an end quickly. First and foremost, we know they are lacking in air power. We've got air superiority. That we could apply in seeing how much of degradation we can bring to bear on them. We also know that they enjoy a great deal of local support, all right? Whatever it is that they are doing to enjoy such local support, once we are able to regain any territory, we make sure that we're able to address such things, all right? There is poverty everywhere in the Northeast, and to a greater extent, some of the recruits are being, attracted by money and what have you, and things like that, So we have to address all this. Our approach in areas that have been conquered, which we refer in the military as the rear area engagement. Our engagement in such rear areas must be such that it is people-oriented and be able to make sure we win the hearts of the people on our side.
Al-Qasim, your thoughts?
Basically, what we need to do as a government is that we need to be able to reduce the ungoverned spaces and dominate the areas. At the moment, our military are engaging in a fight that largely is based on patrols and also a defensive kind of fight. We must be able to dominate and ensure that we take the fight to the insurgents wherever they may be, and also engage in soft approaches of dialogue, of transitional justice, and other measures of returning peace to the Northeast.
Dr. Kaneji, you have the final word. Can Boko Haram be eliminated?
Yes, it can. I think we have to tactically employ both the sticks when we must, and be able to offer the carrots when we can, and make sure that we actually eliminate ungoverned spaces, because while absence of government or the collapse of government is a nightmare for all civilized people, that is a dream come true for most terrorist organizations. So we must make sure that we address that.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your insights. That's all we have time for this week on the program. But thank you to my guests, Colonel Hassan Stan Labo, security consultant and retired Nigerian Army officer; Al-Qasim Abdul Kadir, head of media and communications at the Presidential Committee on the Northeast Initiative; and Dr. Hassan Kaneje, director of the Horn Institute here in Kenya. Remember, we'd love to hear your feedback through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist and keep the conversation going. Tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, goodbye.